In the middle of the celebration, the woman wanted to slip away with her husband to share her happy news, but he had disappeared, and when his mocking voice drifted from the study, she froze. What she heard next chilled her to the bone. "Hello, friends. I trust you with yet another family story, full of contradictions and unexpected twists. Make yourselves comfortable. We are about to embark on a difficult journey." Valentina smoothed the folds of her new sea-green dress and once again glanced at her reflection in the hallway mirror. The dress hid the barely noticeable roundness of her belly, the most precious secret in the world to her. A week ago, 2 lines on a test had turned her world upside down, filling every day with trembling anticipation of the moment when she would be alone with Javier and whisper those cherished words about the coming addition to their family. The clinking of glasses and the muffled voices of guests carried in from the living room, where friends and relatives had already gathered to celebrate Consuelo's birthday. The apartment air was saturated with the aromas of festive dishes, expensive perfumes, and the faint scent of fresh flowers Javier had arranged in every room that morning with the meticulousness that always touched Valentina about her husband. Consuelo, in an elegant burgundy suit, received congratulations with regal dignity, but her sharp eyes, used to controlling everything around her, slid now and then over the faces of the guests, noting every detail of their behavior. She had always been able to read people like an open book, a skill that had served her well since the days when she worked as chief accountant at a large enterprise, needing to distinguish honest people from those trying to push through shady operations. Javier fluttered among the guests with a glass of champagne in hand, but Valentina, who knew his every movement after 5 years of marriage, noticed that his usual ease seemed somewhat forced today, as if he were playing the role of the gracious host instead of being one naturally. His gaze kept drifting towards the phone lying face down on the coffee table, and when another call came, he excused himself and left for the hallway with the expression of someone awaiting urgent business news rather than cheerful greetings. On the table stood a homemade cake with creamy roses, which Valentina had baked the night before, thinking about how in a few months she would be baking birthday cakes for her child. Nearby were salads in crystal bowls, inherited from Javier's grandmother, hot dishes in ceramic forms, and bottles of drinks, among which grape juice in a graceful decanter had been set aside for Valentina. Among the guests were Carmen, the neighbor from across the landing, who always knew all the building's news and shared it with the enthusiasm of a gossip. Manuel, Javier's colleague, telling another story about the struggles of the construction business, and the Rodriguez couple, old family friends who had once introduced Valentina to Javier at one of these same home parties. Conversations drifted from rising utility tariffs to plans for the summer cottage season, from complaints about city traffic jams to admiration of Consuelo's newly renovated apartment. Manuel boasted of buying a new car, while Carmen lamented that the management company had once again raised maintenance fees without consulting residents. Valentina joined in the chatter, laughed at the guests' jokes, and made sure everyone's plates were full, but her thoughts kept circling back to the moment when she could be alone with her husband. She'd already rehearsed how she would begin, which words she would say first, and how she would look into his eyes when she saw the joy and surprise she'd been imagining so vividly these past days. Meanwhile, Consuelo was telling the guests about her summer vacation plans, mentioning the possibility of a family trip to the seaside. At these words, she cast a meaningful glance at Valentina, as if hinting that changes in the family might soon affect all their plans. Valentina blushed under that gaze, wondering whether her mother-in-law had noticed the new roundness of her figure or the changes in her behavior. Javier, in the meantime, took another call and excused himself to the balcony. Valentina followed him with her eyes, noting how he spoke in a low voice, and glanced around often, as if afraid of being overheard. When he returned, his face carried a hint of tension. He tried to mask with a smile, but Valentina, who had learned to read his moods by the subtlest signs, understood that something was troubling him. Carmen once again launched into a story about a neighboring family that had recently moved out, leaving behind unpaid utility bills. This drew everyone into a discussion of modern-day problems. Manuel supported the topic, telling how hard it had become to run an honest business when there were so many temptations to solve issues by less than legal means. Valentina listened and thought how lucky she was with a husband who had always been honest and principled in his work. Javier never told her many details about his business, saying that construction was full of boring technicalities unlikely to interest her, but she always felt his pride in his work and that he would never compromise his conscience for money. Gradually, the guests relaxed, and the atmosphere grew more informal. Consuelo recounted stories of her youth when she worked at the factory and met her future husband. The Rodriguezes reminisced about the early years of their marriage and the hardships they overcame, while Carmen shared recipes for homemade pastries. Valentina listened carefully, projecting these family tales onto her own future with her child. She imagined telling her children how their parents met, how their relationship grew, what struggles they overcame together. In her mind's eye, she saw cozy family evenings, children sitting beside them on the couch, listening to stories, and later, when older, inviting their own friends and hosting gatherings like today's. Javier took yet another call, this time retreating to his study, explaining to the guests that it was about an urgent project requiring immediate attention. Valentina noticed he carried a notebook and pen, as if planning to jot down important information, and thought how demanding work at a construction company must be, even on weekends. The guests continued talking about family values and raising children. Consuelo shared her views on proper upbringing, stressing honesty and principle as the foundation of character. The Rodriguezes agreed, adding that in today's world it was especially important to teach children to tell truth from lies and resist the temptations of easy living at others' expense. Valentina listened with special attention, realizing that soon she herself would need to think about her child's upbringing. In her mind, she drew up a list of the qualities she wanted to instill. First, honesty and kindness, then diligence and responsibility, and also to be a true friend and show compassion for others. Time passed, and Javier still did not return from the study. Valentina began to worry, glancing toward the corridor several times, expecting to see his familiar figure in the doorway. The guests, too, began asking where the host was, and Consuelo explained that work in construction required constant readiness to solve urgent matters. Carmen took advantage of Javier's absence to tell another story about tenants in their building, this time about a young couple from the first floor who constantly quarreled over money, their shouting audible throughout the stairwell. The tale sparked a general discussion about the problems of modern families and the struggles young people face in trying to build a life together. Manuel chimed in, saying how financial problems could ruin even the strongest relationships if spouses didn't know how to compromise and support each other in hard times. He gave examples of acquaintances whose marriages had fallen apart precisely because they couldn't honestly discuss money issues. Valentina listened with unease, thinking how Javier had lately become more reserved about work and finances. He used to readily share details, ask her advice, and tell her about his plans. But in recent months, he limited himself to vague phrases, that everything was fine and she needn't be burdened with details. Meanwhile, Consuelo began setting the tea table, taking out the finest porcelain set she saved for special occasions. Valentina hurried to help, and together they placed cups and saucers, filled bowls with jam and honey, sliced lemon, and prepared everything needed for the evening tea. During these preparations, Consuelo quietly asked her daughter-in-law whether she had noticed anything unusual in Javier's behavior lately. Surprised, Valentina replied that her husband might be a bit overworked, but otherwise all was well. Her mother-in-law nodded thoughtfully and let the matter drop. The guests admired the beautifully set tea table and praised the treats. The cake was especially successful, and Carmen asked for the recipe, promising to bake the same for her family. Valentina gladly shared her secrets, thinking how wonderful it would be one day to pass these recipes onto her own child when they grew up. The conversation smoothly shifted to the topic of family traditions and the importance of preserving the bond between generations. Consuelo spoke about her family traditions, how her mother had taught her to cook and manage the household, and how she, in turn, passed that knowledge on to her daughter-in-law. Valentina listened gratefully, realizing how much the support and experience of the older generation meant to her. Javier still hadn't reappeared, and Valentina decided it was time to check whether he was all right. She excused herself from the guests and headed to the study, her heart pounding with anticipation of finally sharing her joyful news with her husband. The hallway was quiet, only the muffled voices of the guests drifting in from the living room. As she approached the study door, Valentina heard her husband speaking on the phone. The tone of his voice struck her as strange. There were notes in it she had never heard before. It was mocking, almost cynical, completely unlike the gentle, caring Javier she knew. She stopped at the door, hesitant to enter, and involuntarily listened in. What she heard next froze her blood and made her heart pound so loudly she feared her husband might hear it through the door. Valentina pressed herself against the cold surface of the study door, shivering at the words filtering through. Javier's voice carried through the thin partition with chilling clarity, and every word fell on her heart like a heavy stone. "Eduardo, I told you, everything is under control," her husband said in a tone stripped of the softness she was so used to hearing at home. "She suspects nothing. So naive. She thinks life is that simple." A coarse male voice replied from the phone speaker. "Javier, I don't like how much you're risking. Your wife's a teacher, so she's not a fool. Sooner or later, she'll start asking questions. Where the money for this fancy life comes from." Javier laughed, and that laugh sounded utterly foreign to Valentina, as if it came from a stranger. "What can I say, Eduardo? She's used to seeing only the good in people. When I tell her I got a bonus or some reward for good work, she doesn't even ask for details. She takes me at my word, like a child." Nausea rose in Valentina's throat. Her own trustfulness, something she had always considered a sign of love, turned out to be the object of her husband's mockery in front of a stranger. She remembered all the times Javier had brought home expensive gifts, explaining them away with successes at work, and how she had rejoiced at his achievements, proud of him. All right, the other man continued. "But this is serious, Javier. $300,000 isn't a joke. Are the land documents ready?" "They're ready, Eduardo. My contact at the land committee did his part. The papers look absolutely legitimate. Buyers won't even suspect the plots were sold to someone else 6 months ago." Valentina clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a cry. So her husband was a fraud. The money they had been living on for the past 2 years, buying furniture, renovating, planning vacations, was all earned dishonestly. And she, foolish and naive, as he himself had said, had rejoiced at their prosperity and considered herself a happy woman. "Good. We'll meet Monday at the usual place. You bring the documents, I'll bring the money. After that, you'll be free for a couple of months until the dust settles." "Understood, Eduardo, but what about my situation at home?" "What situation?" The voice on the line sharpened. Javier paused for a few seconds, and Valentina heard him opening and closing a desk drawer, as if searching for something or just fidgeting nervously. "You see, My wife has started paying more attention to my affairs lately. She asks about business trips, who I meet with, why the phone rings so often. Of course, she's naive, but still. And what do you tell her? For now, I brush it off with vague answers, but I fear it can't go on forever. Valentina isn't stupid, just trusting. You might be right. If she starts digging, she could find out the truth. Valentina felt a strange mixture, hurt that her husband considered her a gullible fool, and bitter satisfaction that he at least admitted she was capable of understanding what was happening. But those thoughts were quickly replaced by horror, as she realized her suspicions could endanger not only their relationship, but also her own safety. Listen, Javier. Eduardo's voice grew harsher. If there's even the slightest risk your wife might find out, you have to take measures. We're not playing children's games here. What kind of measures? Javier's voice betrayed unease. I don't know. Send her to relatives for a couple of weeks. Make something up. Tell her your mother's ill, whatever. The main thing is to keep her out of the way for now. Javier thought for a moment, and Valentina heard him pacing the study. The parquet creaked under his steps just as it did in the mornings when he rose before her to make coffee. But now that familiar sound felt ominous, as though even their home had turned into a hostile, alien place. The problem is, Eduardo, she has no close relatives. Her parents died when she was a student. She was raised by her grandmother, but she's long gone too. Only my mother is left, but they're not close enough for Valentina to agree to stay with her for 2 weeks without a serious reason. Then invent a serious reason, the man snapped. What, you can't handle your own wife? There was a metallic edge in Javier's voice Valentina had never heard before. I'll handle it. Don't worry. I just wanted to warn you there might be complications. Javier, you understand me. This deal could set us up for years, but if anything goes wrong, we'll both end up in prison for a long time. So no accidents, no risks. I understand, Eduardo. Valentina heard her husband step toward the study window. She recognized the sound. The floorboards creaked by the sill where he liked to stand and think. She had once considered those moments signs of his reflective nature, but now she realized he had been planning crimes. Actually, Javier, maybe you should think about a more radical solution. Eduardo's voice turned sly. What do you mean? Well, you're young, good-looking. After our deal, you'll have enough money to start a new life. Why keep unnecessary baggage? Javier was silent for so long Valentina thought the call had dropped. Her heart pounded so violently she feared it could be heard inside the study. Finally, her husband answered, Eduardo, I've thought about that, but I'm not ready for such drastic steps yet. Valentina is a good woman. She doesn't deserve... Javier, in our business, there's no room for sentimentality, the other man cut him off. You're either a professional or a fool who'll eventually get caught. I'm a professional, Javier said, and his voice carried an icy resolve. But for now, we'll manage without extremes. I'll find a way to keep my wife out of our business. Valentina's knees gave way. She sank slowly to the floor, leaning her back against the wall. Thousands of thoughts swarmed in her mind, but none formed a clear picture. The man she had loved for 5 years, with whom she had dreamed of raising children, turned out to be a swindler, one who was discussing how to get rid of her as if she were nothing more than an obstacle. All right, Javier, said Eduardo, but remember, after Monday there's no going back. If the deal falls through because of your family problems, you'll answer not only to me, but to other people who put their money into this. Everything will be clean, I promise. Good. Then see you Monday. Valentina heard the short beep signaling the call had ended. Silence settled over the study, broken only by the ticking of the desk clock and the muffled voices of the guests in the living room. She sat on the hallway floor, leaning against the wall, trying to process what she'd heard. Javier had been deceiving her for 2 years. All their achievements, their beautiful life, had been built on stolen money. And now he was planning another major scam and discussing the possibility of getting rid of her if she became an obstacle. Valentina remembered the secret she carried under her heart, and she felt sick thinking about what fate might await her child. Footsteps sounded in the study, and Valentina realized Javier was coming to the door. She quickly got to her feet, smoothed her dress, and tried to look natural. When the door opened, she was standing a few steps away, as if she had just approached. "Valentina, darling." Javier smiled with the same warm smile she loved so much. "I've just finished an important call. What's wrong?" She looked at him and didn't recognize him. The same man she had married 5 years ago stood before her, but now she saw something foreign, unfamiliar in his eyes. Or perhaps she herself had changed in those few minutes by the study door. "The guests are asking where you are," she said, surprised that her voice sounded almost normal. "Mother is setting the tea table." "Of course I'm coming." Javier took her hand, and Valentina barely suppressed the urge to pull away. "Sorry I took so long. Work, you understand." Work. How easily he said that word, as if he truly did something lawful and respectable. Valentina nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They walked to the living room where the guests were waiting, but for her that short walk felt like an eternity. They were greeted with cheerful exclamations. Consuelo had already brewed tea and set out sweets. Carmen was telling yet another story about the neighbors. Manuel was discussing weekend plans with the Rodriguezes. "And here's our host," said Consuelo. But Valentina noticed her mother-in-law watching her son closely, as if trying to figure something out. "Sorry to keep you waiting," Javier said, settling into an armchair. "An urgent call from a client. They want changes to the project." He lied so naturally that Valentina felt nauseous. How often had he lied to her before? How many times had she believed his explanations about work, bonuses, business trips, never suspecting the crimes behind it all? "Work is work," Manuel observed philosophically. "In our business, the client is always right, even when he's wrong." Everyone laughed, and the conversation flowed on. Valentina took part mechanically, answering questions, smiling where appropriate. But her thoughts were far away. She wondered what to do next. Could she go on living with a man who turned out to be nothing like she thought? Could she raise a child with him? Meanwhile, Javier chatted about plans for the coming week, mentioning an important business trip on Monday. Valentina flinched, remembering the meeting with Eduardo, and her husband noticed. "Is something wrong, dear?" "Just a bit tired," she replied. "A lot of fuss getting the party ready." "Of course she's tired," Consuelo said kindly. Valentina worked so hard to make everything beautiful. She even baked the cake and hung the decorations. The guests once again praised how wonderfully the party was organized, and Valentina smiled at their compliments. But inside she felt chilled by the realization that this beautiful life was built on lies and crimes. Gradually, the evening drew to a close. The guests began gathering their things, thanking them for the hospitality and a lovely night. Consuelo accepted their thanks with dignity. Javier helped them with their coats and walked them to the door. Valentina packed up the remaining cake so they could take some home. When the door closed behind the last guest, the apartment fell quiet. Consuelo sat in an armchair and slipped off her shoes. "It was a lovely evening," she said. "Thank you, children, for your care." Javier came over and kissed his mother on the cheek. "Happy birthday, Mom. Wishing you health and many years." Valentina watched and wondered whether Consuelo knew the truth about her son's affairs. Could she be part of the deception, or was she also a victim of his lies? "I'm going to take a shower," Javier said, "and you ladies don't worry about the cleanup. We'll put everything in order tomorrow together." He went to the bathroom, and Valentina was left alone with her mother-in-law. Consuelo studied her carefully. "Valentina, are you all right? You look a bit pale." Valentina wanted to say everything was fine, but the words stuck in her throat. Maybe this was the moment to confide in the only close person left to her, now that Javier had turned from loving husband into a stranger. Valentina looked into her mother-in-law's eyes and felt two impulses battling within her, to tell the truth and to preserve the appearance of a normal family life. Consuelo waited, and in her gaze, Valentina read an understanding that her daughter-in-law was going through something serious. "Consuelo," Valentina began, then stopped, not knowing how to continue. "How do you say that your husband turned out to be a crook? How do you explain that your family idyll was built on deceit?" "Sit down, dear," her mother-in-law said gently, indicating the sofa. "Tell me what happened. I can see you're upset." Valentina sank onto the sofa and clasped her hands to hide their tremor. Water hummed in the bathroom, reminding her that Javier could return at any moment, but she knew she could no longer remain silent. "I accidentally overheard Javier's phone call," she said quietly. Consuelo frowned. "And what did you hear?" "He was talking to someone named Eduardo about money, about documents for land plots. They're planning some kind of deal for $300,000. Her mother-in-law's face grew grave. She rose and went to the window, looking out at the city lights. In profile, her features were stern and focused, like in the old days when she worked as a chief accountant and had to make weighty decisions. "Go on," she said without turning. Slowly, careful not to miss a detail, Valentina recounted the entire overheard conversation. With every word, Consuelo's face darkened. When Valentina reached the part where Javier called her naive, Consuelo spun around sharply. "So he thinks you're a little fool who's easy to deceive?" Barely contained anger edged her voice. "It seems so." Valentina felt tears rising. And when his partner started talking about how something had to be done about me, she couldn't finish. The memory of her husband discussing the possibility of getting rid of her made her shudder with horror and disgust. Consuelo quickly crossed to the sofa, sat beside her daughter-in-law, and put an arm around her shoulders. "Valentina, dear, calm down. We'll sort this out." "How can we sort this out?" Valentina sobbed. "It turns out my husband is a swindler and I didn't even suspect it. How could I have been so blind?" "You're not blind," Consuelo said firmly. "You simply trusted the man you love. That's normal in a family." Valentina raised her tear-filled eyes. "And you? Did you know about his dealings?" Consuelo sighed heavily and leaned back. "I suspected. In recent months, I've seen changes in his behavior, but I hoped I was wrong." "What changes?" "Expensive gifts he couldn't afford before. A sudden desire to rent a country house in a prestigious village. Strange visitors who came when you were out. And most of all, he became secretive, stopped talking about work." Valentina recalled all the moments that now seemed suspicious. Javier had indeed changed, but she had chalked it up to work fatigue and ignored the little things. "I thought he was just overworked," she said. "I didn't want to pry and seem a nagging wife." "And he took advantage of your tact," Consuelo said bitterly. "You know, Valentina, I worked as an accountant for many years. I've seen all sorts and learned to tell the honest from the crooked by small signs. Dishonest people have patterns. They get secretive, dodge straight answers, and change the subject when money comes up." "But why didn't I see it?" "Because you looked at him with a loving wife's eyes, not an investigator's," her mother-in-law explained gently, "and because he played the caring husband very well." The water in the bathroom stopped, and the women fell silent. Javier would soon return, and they would have to act as if nothing had happened. But Valentina knew she could no longer meet his eyes, now that she knew the truth about his affairs. "What should I do?" she whispered. "For now, Nothing. Consuelo answered just as softly. We need to think, gather more information. Maybe it isn't as bad as it seems. Valentina was about to say that it really was that frightening. But just then, Javier walked into the living room. He had changed into jeans and a sweater and looked relaxed and pleased. "What are you ladies chatting about?" he asked, sitting down in the armchair opposite the sofa. "We're discussing what a lovely evening it was," Consuelo replied calmly. The guests enjoyed themselves very much. "Yes, the party was a success," Javier agreed, smiling at his wife. "Valentina, you were wonderful. Everything was flawlessly organized." Valentina nodded, not trusting her voice. She looked at her husband and tried to understand how he could so effortlessly play the role of a loving spouse while planning to deceive her and possibly abandon her. "Javier, what's this trip you have on Monday?" Consuelo asked suddenly. Valentina flinched at the question. Was her mother-in-law going to test her son right now? "A business meeting with clients," Javier answered, and Valentina noticed a brief tension in him. A new project, quite a large one. "I see," his mother nodded. "Will you be away long?" "No, it's a local meeting. I'll be back by evening." The lies followed one after another so easily, it was as if lying was all Javier had ever done. Valentina wondered how many times he'd deceived her before, and the thought made her feel sick. "And who are you meeting?" Consuelo pressed on, a steely note entering her voice, one Valentina recognized from the rare times her mother-in-law was truly displeased. Javier hesitated. "An investor. He wants to put money into a residential complex." "What's his name?" "Mom, why do you need those details?" Javier began to grow irritated. "These are work matters." "Just taking an interest in my son's affairs," Consuelo said evenly. "You used to talk about work quite willingly." Valentina could see Javier tensing under his mother's questions. He fiddled with the TV remote, avoided eye contact, clearly looking for a way to change the subject. "Valentina, you've gone pale again," Javier noted. "Maybe you should lie down. It's been a long day." She wanted to get up and go to the bedroom, but realized she couldn't lie in the same bed with a man who had become a stranger. The thought of pretending to sleep beside him was unbearable. "Yes, I'll go rest," she said, rising from the sofa. "I'll turn in soon too," Javier said. "I'll just help Mom tidy up." "Don't touch a thing," Consuelo objected. "We'll clean up in the morning. Go get some rest." In the bedroom, Valentina changed into a nightgown and lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. She lay with her eyes closed, listening to the sounds from the living room where Javier was talking to his mother. Their voices were muffled. She couldn't make out the words, but the tones sounded tense. A terrifying thought began to take shape inside her. What if, once he learned she was pregnant, Javier decided his wife had become an even bigger obstacle to his plans? With a child, it would be much harder to hide his criminal activity. Valentina instinctively laid a hand on her stomach, where a new life was growing beneath her heart. Now she had to protect not only herself, but her child as well. Javier entered the bedroom quietly, trying not to wake her. He undressed and lay down beside her, but didn't touch her, as he usually did before sleep. Valentina felt him there and tried to breathe evenly, pretending to be asleep. "Valentina," he whispered. She didn't answer, continuing to feign sleep. "Valentina, I know you're not asleep." Her heart lurched with fear. Had he guessed she had eavesdropped on his call? But Valentina kept silent. "All right," Javier sighed. "We'll talk tomorrow." He turned onto his side, away from her, and after a few minutes, his breathing grew steady. Valentina lay awake until morning, thinking about what to do next and whom she could trust in this terrifying situation. Scenes from the past months reeled through her mind. How Javier explained the new purchases, how he answered her questions about work, how he behaved at home. Now all those memories formed a different picture, one in which her husband appeared as a skillful deceiver. She remembered how 3 months ago he had given her expensive earrings, explaining it with a large bonus. How 2 months ago he had insisted on buying new living room furniture, saying the company had paid out year-end bonuses to everyone. How a month ago he had suggested an expensive resort vacation, citing the successful completion of a major project. All those explanations turned out to be lies. The money was stolen, and she, naive fool that she was, had rejoiced in her husband's success and boasted of him to her friends. It was painful to think how she had told colleagues what an honest and successful man she had. In the morning, Javier got up early, as he usually did on weekends, and went to the kitchen to make breakfast. Valentina heard him fussing with dishes, starting the coffee maker, heating something in the microwave. Those familiar sounds had once filled her heart with warmth and gratitude toward a caring husband. Now they seemed as false as everything else in their life. Consuelo also rose early and joined her son in the kitchen. Valentina heard their muted voices and sensed they were having a serious conversation. Perhaps her mother-in-law had decided to confront Javier about his affairs. From bits and pieces that reached the bedroom, Valentina gathered that Consuelo was asking about his work, and he was answering evasively and irritably. At one point, the conversation grew more heated, and Valentina heard Javier raise his voice. "Mom, stop it. I'm an adult. I can handle my own business." "That's exactly why I'm worried," Consuelo replied coolly. "Adults must take responsibility for their actions." After that, the kitchen fell silent, and Valentina realized it was time to get up. She could no longer hide in bed from reality. She had to decide something, do something. At last she got up and went to the bathroom. The mirror showed a pale face with dark circles under the eyes. In one night, she had aged several years, and even she could see it. In the kitchen, she was met by the concerned faces of her husband and mother-in-law. Breakfast, an omelet, fresh rolls, coffee, and juice, sat on the table. Everything looked as usual, but the air was tense. "Good morning, dear," Javier said, coming over to kiss her cheek. "How did you sleep?" "Not very well," Valentina answered honestly, sitting down at the table. "Perhaps you should see a doctor," Consuelo suggested. "You look rather tired." Valentina raised her eyes to her mother-in-law and saw understanding there. Consuelo hadn't suggested a doctor for nothing. Perhaps she wanted Valentina to leave the house for a while and think things over in peace. "Yes, I suppose I'll see a GP," she agreed. "And I'm meeting Manuel today," Javier said, pouring himself coffee. "We'll go over the details of tomorrow's trip." Valentina flinched, remembering Monday and the meeting with Eduardo. So her husband was continuing to prepare for his criminal deal as if nothing had changed. "Javier," Consuelo said unexpectedly, "are you sure you need to go tomorrow? Maybe you should postpone the meeting." Her son looked at her in surprise. "Why? It's an important project, Mom. It can't be postponed." "I just have a bad feeling," she said. "You know, with age, you start paying more attention to your intuition." Javier laughed, but to Valentina, his laughter sounded forced. "Mom, it's just a business meeting. What could happen?" Consuelo shrugged and didn't press the point, but Valentina could see that her mother-in-law was thinking, planning something. Breakfast passed in relative silence. Each was preoccupied with their thoughts, and no one dared broach what truly troubled them. Javier read the news on his phone. Consuelo planned her day, and Valentina tried to figure out how to proceed. After breakfast, Javier announced he was off to meet Manuel and left the house. Valentina was alone with her mother-in-law, and a heavy silence immediately settled between them. "Valentina," Consuelo said at last, "I need to tell you something." "What?" Valentina asked tensely. "Last night, after you went to bed, I spoke with Javier. I tried to understand what's going on in his life." "And what did he say?" Nothing definite, but I realized my suspicions were justified. He really is involved in something illegal. Valentina felt everything inside her drop away. Her last hope that this was all a misunderstanding vanished. "What should I do now?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," Consuelo admitted, "but I do know one thing. You need to think about your future, and not just your own." She gave Valentina a meaningful look, and Valentina realized her mother-in-law suspected the pregnancy. Perhaps a woman's intuition had picked up what male eyes had not yet noticed. "Consuelo," Valentina said, deciding to confide in the only close person she had left. "I have news I meant to tell Javier last night." "What news?" "I'm pregnant. I found out a week ago." Consuelo's face lit with joy, then immediately grew serious. "Congratulations, my dear. That's wonderful news, but now the situation becomes even more complicated." "I understand," Valentina nodded. "That's why I didn't tell him yesterday. How can I raise a child with a man who lives by crime?" "You can't," her mother-in-law said firmly, "but you also can't make decisions in the heat of emotion. We need to think everything through carefully." They sat in the kitchen in the morning sun streaming through the window, both understanding that their lives had changed radically. Yesterday's celebration felt like something from another life before they knew the terrible truth about Javier. "What if he finds out about the baby?" Valentina asked. "He shouldn't yet," her mother-in-law replied. "You said it's still early days?" "Yes, but I won't be able to hide it for long." Consuelo pondered, then said decisively, "Listen to me carefully, Valentina. Whatever happens next, remember, I'm on your side and on the side of my grandchild, whether grandson or granddaughter." Those words became Valentina's only support in a collapsing world. She was no longer alone in her terror and confusion. She had an ally who would help protect her and the child. "But he's your son," Valentina said. "How can you choose between us?" Consuelo stood and walked to the window. "Valentina, I love Javier. He's my only child. But I can't close my eyes to the fact he's turned into a criminal. And most importantly, I cannot allow him to harm you or the baby." Sunday dragged on painfully. Javier returned from his meeting by lunchtime, tense and irritable, completely unlike his usual weekend self. He barely touched the food Consuelo had prepared, kept getting distracted by his phone, and several times stepped out onto the balcony to talk to someone. Valentina watched her husband and understood that tomorrow's meeting with Eduardo truly worried him. She tried to imagine what he was thinking, what plans he was making, and the thoughts made her sick. Was he really ready to commit such a large fraud for the sake of money? "Javier, won't you tell us what's going on?" Consuelo asked carefully over lunch. "It's obvious you're anxious." "Nothing special, Mom," he waved her off. "Just a big deal tomorrow. Lots of money, lots of documents. Everything has to go perfectly. And if something goes wrong?" Javier raised his eyes to his mother, and something unpleasant flickered there. "Nothing will go wrong. I've thought everything through to the last detail." Valentina felt an icy twinge near her heart. There was such confidence of impunity in his voice that it was frightening. Did he truly consider himself untouchable? After lunch, Javier locked himself in the study, supposedly to prepare documents for tomorrow's meeting. Valentina and Consuelo stayed in the kitchen, washing dishes and quietly discussing what lay ahead. "I thought about our conversation all night," her mother-in-law said, drying a plate, "and I've decided we need to act." "Act how?" Valentina asked, frightened. "Gather evidence of his criminal activity and take it where it needs to go." Valentina dropped the cup she'd been washing. It clinked against the sink. "Are you serious? But he's your son." "Precisely why I can't let him slide all the way into the abyss," Consuelo said firmly. Better he face punishment now than get caught later for something even worse. Valentina turned over her words and saw the logic in them. But imagining Javier being arrested, ending up in prison, it was unbearably painful despite everything that had happened. "What if we're mistaken?" she offered weakly. "Maybe it's not as bad as it seems." Consuelo stopped and looked at her closely. "Valentina, you heard the call yourself. They talked about forged documents and stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars. What is there to doubt?" At that moment, muffled voices came from the study. Javier was on the phone again, his tone excited. The women exchanged glances, and Consuelo headed for the hall with resolve. "Where are you going?" Valentina whispered. "To listen to what he's saying. Maybe we'll learn something new." They approached the study door cautiously and listened. Javier was speaking louder than usual, apparently agitated about tomorrow's meeting. "Eduardo, I told you everything is ready," he was saying. "The documents are drawn up, seals affixed, signatures in place. The buyers won't suspect a thing." A familiar, rough voice came from the speaker. "Javier, you do realize that tomorrow is the point of no return? Once we get the money, we're criminals in the eyes of the law." "I understand." "So what? The main thing is not to get caught. And if you do?" "We won't," Javier said confidently. "I've got a plan for that." "What plan?" Javier fell silent, and Valentina pressed closer to the door, afraid to miss his answer. "If something goes wrong, I'll disappear. Papers in a new name are ready. I'll transfer the money offshore. In a month, I won't be here." "And your wife? She could turn you in." "She won't," Javier laughed, and the sound made Valentina shudder. "She has no idea what I'm doing. Too trusting." "And if she does suspect something? Then I'll have to take measures." "What measures?" "I don't know. Maybe send her to relatives far away, or I'll think of something else." Valentina felt her blood run cold. The man she'd loved for 5 years was calmly discussing getting rid of her if she interfered with his criminal plans. "In fact," Javier went on, "maybe it's for the best. It's all turning out this way. I'm tired of family life, of constantly having to lie and pretend. So you plan to dump your wife regardless?" "Most likely, yes. New life, new opportunities. Why carry extra ballast?" Consuelo grabbed her daughter-in-law's hand and pulled her away from the door. Rage burned so brightly in her eyes that Valentina was frightened. They went to the kitchen, and Consuelo shut the door. "Scoundrel," she said softly, but with such fury that it hissed. "How dare he talk about you like that? About his wife?" Valentina sank onto a chair and covered her face with her hands. Hearing that her husband considered her ballast and planned to leave her anyway was unbearable. All her dreams of a happy family life, of children they would raise together, collapsed for good. "Valentina, enough tears," Consuelo said, sitting beside her. "Now you know exactly what kind of man he is, and now you know what must be done." "What?" Valentina sobbed. "Save yourself and the child, and at the same time save him, though he doesn't deserve it." "How do we save ourselves?" "Tonight we'll find the documents in his study, the ones he mentioned. We'll gather all the evidence, and tomorrow morning, while he's at the meeting with this Eduardo, we'll hand it over to law enforcement." Valentina lifted her head and looked at her mother-in-law. The resolve in her eyes made it clear. Consuelo would not back down. "But they'll arrest him," Valentina protested weakly. "And they'll be right to. Better a few years in prison than a criminal's life that will end badly sooner or later." "What will happen to me? To the baby?" Consuelo took her daughter-in-law's hands in hers. "You'll live with me. I'll help you raise my grandchild. We'll manage without him." Valentina looked into her mother-in-law's eyes and saw sincerity and a readiness to stand by her. Perhaps this truly was the only way out. What if he finds out we turned him in? He won't. We'll do everything carefully. They sat in the kitchen planning how to gather proof of Javier's criminal activity, while in the next room he continued preparing for tomorrow's meeting, unaware that his wife and mother were plotting to destroy all his plans. That evening, Javier had dinner in the study at his desk, poring over papers. Valentina brought him tea and noticed documents on the table with official seals and signatures. Her heart started pounding. Were these the very forged papers he'd mentioned? "Thanks, darling," Javier said without looking up. "You can go. I'll keep working." "Don't stay up too late," Valentina said, trying to sound normal. "Tomorrow's an important day." "Yes, important," he agreed. "Very important." When Valentina left the study, she had the strange feeling she was seeing her husband for the last time. Tomorrow, his life would change completely, and he would become someone else, an arrested criminal instead of a successful manager. That night, Valentina lay in bed waiting for Javier to fall asleep. He came in late, tossed and turned for a long time, mumbled something in his sleep, and then his breathing grew even and deep. She slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the living room where Consuelo was waiting. "Ready?" her mother-in-law whispered. "Ready," Valentina answered, though inside she was trembling with fear and nerves. They slipped into the study. Consuelo turned on the desk lamp, covering it with a scarf to dim the light. The very documents Valentina had seen earlier lay on the table. "Look," her mother-in-law whispered, examining the papers. "Contracts for the sale of land plots. The seals look genuine, the signatures too." "So where's the forgery?" "In the fact that these plots were sold to other people 6 months ago, and he's selling them again." Valentina picked up one of the contracts and saw her husband's familiar handwriting beneath the signature of some official. So he'd been forging the signatures of public officers. "We need to photograph everything," Consuelo said, taking out her phone. They methodically photographed every document, every stamp, every signature. In the desk drawers, they found several more folders with suspicious papers, contracts with shell companies, income statements with inflated sums, documents for offshore accounts. "My God," Valentina whispered, examining the income statement in her husband's name. "It says he makes 5 times more than he actually does." "It's for the bank. To get a loan," Consuelo explained. "That's fraud, too." They found a notebook where Javier had planned his operations. Accomplices' phone numbers, deal amounts, meeting dates. It all looked like the blueprint of a criminal organization. "Enough," Consuelo said, setting the notebook aside. "We have plenty of evidence." They carefully put everything back, turned off the lamp, and slipped out of the study. In the hallway, Valentina could no longer hold back and began to cry. "Hush," her mother-in-law whispered, embracing her. "The hardest part is behind us. Tomorrow it will be over." "I feel sorry for him," Valentina sobbed. "Despite everything, he's the father of my child." "I know, dear. I feel sorry for him, too. He's my son, after all. But there's no other way. He'll be caught anyway, sooner rather than later. This way he'll have a chance to think, and while not everything is lost yet, get off with a lighter punishment." They returned to their rooms, but neither could sleep until morning. Valentina lay beside her husband, thinking this was their last night together. Tomorrow he would go to meet Eduardo, not knowing that an arrest awaited him. In the morning, Javier got up early and took his time getting ready. He put on his best suit, shaved carefully, tidied his hair. At breakfast, he was silent and focused. "Good luck at the meeting," Consuelo said, looking at her son. "Thanks, Mom. I think it will go well." "When will you be back?" Valentina asked. "By evening. Maybe we'll celebrate a successful deal." He kissed his wife on the cheek, hugged his mother, and left. At the door, he turned and waved. Valentina watched him go, realizing she was seeing her husband for the last time as a free man. All right, Consuelo said as soon as the door closed behind him. Now it's our turn. They dressed and went to the district police station. On the way, Valentina several times wanted to ask her mother-in-law to turn back, but she knew there was no way out now. At the station, they were received by the duty investigator, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and gray stubble. He listened to their story, looked through the photos of the documents, and frowned. "Serious allegations," he said. "If this is true, we're talking about large-scale fraud." "It's true," Consuelo said firmly. "My son is planning to pull off a $300,000 scam." "Where is he now?" "Meeting his accomplices in the cafe on the square." Valentina gave the address she'd heard during the phone call. The investigator picked up the phone and began issuing orders. Half an hour later, a car with officers headed to the location. Valentina and Consuelo sat in the corridor and waited for news. Time dragged unbearably. Valentina wondered what was happening to Javier. Had he realized he was trapped? Did he suspect who had turned him in? An hour later, the investigator came out to them. "We've detained them. Your husband and 2 accomplices were taken during the handoff. They had forged documents and a large amount of cash on them." Valentina felt her legs give way. So it was over. Javier had been arrested. His criminal career was finished. "What happens next?" Consuelo asked. "Investigation, trial. With evidence like this, he'll get several years in a penal colony." They stepped outside, and for the first time in many days, Valentina could breathe freely. The nightmare had ended. True, other difficulties lay ahead, but the worst was behind them. "Do you regret it?" Consuelo asked. "No," Valentina answered after a long pause. "We did the right thing, for the child's sake." They took a bus home. The apartment was quiet and empty without Javier. His half-finished morning coffee still sat on the kitchen table. Papers lay in the study, papers he would never use again. "What now?" Valentina asked. "Now we start a new life," Consuelo said, "without lies and crimes, an honest life for you and the baby to come." That evening, the investigator called to say Javier had given a statement and confessed to fraud. He named all his accomplices and described other crimes from the past 2 years. "He asked me to tell his wife he doesn't hold a grudge and understands everything," the investigator added. He also asked for forgiveness. Valentina hung up and burst into tears, not from grief, but from relief. The chapter of her life filled with lies and deceit had been turned. Ahead lay a new chapter, hard but honest. 6 months passed since Javier was arrested in a cafe on the central square. 6 months that completely changed Valentina, turning her from a naive housewife into a strong woman capable of making hard decisions and taking responsibility not only for herself, but for the little person growing under her heart. March turned out warm and sunny, rare for that time of year. Valentina stood by the maternity ward window, watching the snow melt in the yard, thinking how symbolic it was that her daughter was born in spring, when nature awakens to new life. "You've got a beautiful little one," a nurse said, approaching with a tiny bundle in a pink blanket. "Looks like her mom." Valentina took her daughter and marveled at how something so small and fragile could hold all the hope for the future. The baby opened her eyes and looked at her mother with that solemn newborn gaze, as if she still remembered something important from the life she had just left. "What will you name her?" the nurse asked, filling out the paperwork. "Esperanza," Valentina answered without hesitation. "Esperanza Javierovna." She had decided to give her daughter a patronymic from her father, despite everything that had happened. Javier was and remained the child's father, and the girl had the right to know whose daughter she was when she grew up and could understand the complexities of adult relationships. Consuelo came into the room with a huge bouquet of white chrysanthemums and a bag of baby things. In these months, she had become not just a mother-in-law to Valentina, but a true mother, replacing the family Valentina had lost in her youth. "Well then, introduce me to my granddaughter," she said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Meet her, Grandma. This is Esperanza." Consuelo gently took the baby in her arms, her eyes filling with tears. "My God, she's so tiny and so beautiful. She weighs 3 kilos, 200 grams, Valentina said proudly. "The doctors say she's perfectly healthy." "Of course she is. She has such a strong mother." They sat in the quiet of the hospital room, passing the baby back and forth, unable to get enough of her. The sun shone outside, melting the last remnants of winter, and it seemed the whole world rejoiced at this child's birth. "How are things with the apartment?" Valentina asked, rocking her daughter. "All settled. The court ruled that since the apartment was bought with honestly earned money before Javier started his fraud, it remains yours. The proceeds of crime were confiscated, but they won't touch the home. This was a great relief to Valentina. She had feared they would be evicted, and she and the baby would have to live with Consuelo in the one-room flat she had inherited from her parents." "And work?" "The school principal said your elementary teacher position is waiting. When you're ready to return from maternity leave, come right back." Valentina nodded. Work was necessary not just for money, but to feel useful, to bring good to others. After all she'd been through, it mattered to know she was doing something honest and worthy. "Consuelo, do you regret what we did?" Valentina asked suddenly. Her mother-in-law looked at her granddaughter for a long time, then slowly shook her head. "No, I don't. We saved him from worse crimes. And most importantly, we saved you and the baby from a life built on lies. I saw plenty of cases like this in the wild 90s, and not one ended well. In the best case, justice caught up with those would-be businessmen. In the worst, their partners, or defrauded citizens, did. Some were later declared legally dead, if you get my meaning. Others were buried in closed coffins. So I have no regrets. I gave Javier life, and now I'm giving him a chance. And how is he? Has he written?" "He has, but I haven't read the letters. I put them in a box on your desk. Read them when you're ready." Valentina knew about the letters but wasn't ready to read them yet. The wounds were too fresh. The memories of her world collapsing that October evening were still too painful. A nurse poked her head into the room. "Valentina, you have a visitor. A friend," she says. "You can send her in." Rocio, her colleague from school and friend of several years, entered, carrying a box of chocolates and a soft pink bunny toy. "Well, show me your princess," Rocio said, coming to the bed. "Meet Esperanza. Esperanza, this is Auntie Rocio, your future teacher." Rocio gently stroked the baby's cheek. "A beauty. Looks just like you." "Everyone says so." Valentina smiled. "Not like her father?" An awkward pause fell. Rocio knew what had happened with Javier, but tried not to touch on it with her friend. "Maybe a little," Valentina answered cautiously. "She has his chin." "Well, that's not so bad. What matters is she gets her mother's character." Consuelo stood. "I'll pop to the cafe for some tea. You girls talk." When she left, Rocio sat closer. "How are you holding up? Be honest." "Better than I expected," Valentina admitted. "The first months were hard, especially when the trial started. But then I calmed down somehow. I realized life goes on." "Plans? When will you go back to work?" "In about a year, I think. I want to raise my daughter myself while she's tiny. We'll see after that. If you need anything, ask. I'll help however I can." "Thank you, but I have Consuelo. She's better than any mother could be." "That's true. Few mothers-in-law would do what she's done." After Rocio left, Valentina was alone with her daughter. The little one slept, and she could think calmly about the past and about the future. These 6 months had been the hardest of her life. First Javier's arrest, then the interrogations where she was summoned as a witness, then the trial where she saw her husband in the defendant's box, thin, gaunt shame in his eyes. He received 5 years in a general regime colony, which was a fairly lenient sentence for the charges. The judge took into account that he confessed, repented, and helped the investigation uncover the entire criminal scheme. All that time, Valentina lived as if in a dream. She went to work until her belly grew too large, prepared for the baby's arrival, and set up the nursery. In the evenings, she sat with Consuelo in the kitchen. They talked about the future, made plans, and supported each other. Gradually, the sharpness of her emotions dulled. Valentina realized she couldn't mourn shattered illusions forever. She would have a child who needed a strong, self-assured mother, not a perpetually weeping woman who pitied herself. She began reading books on pedagogy and child psychology, enrolled in prenatal classes, and connected with other expectant mothers. Slowly, the fear of being alone gave way to anticipation of meeting her baby. Now all that was behind her. Now she had a daughter. "Are you sleeping, Princess?" Valentina asked softly, looking at her child. The little girl seemed to hear her mother's voice and opened her eyes. There was so much trust and love in them that Valentina felt her heart overflow with tenderness. "You know, little one," she whispered, "we're going to have a good life, honest and bright. Not like your father's, something entirely different." Esperanza yawned and closed her eyes again. Valentina gently adjusted the blanket and wondered what she would tell her daughter about her father when she grew older and began to ask questions. The next day, they were discharged from the maternity hospital. Consuelo arrived in a taxi loaded with baby things, flowers, and gifts from Valentina's school colleagues. The driver helped carry everything upstairs and sincerely marveled at how beautiful the baby was. At home, everything was ready for mother and child. The nursery had a crib with a canopy, a changing table, a dresser filled with baby clothes. Bright pictures of animals hung on the walls, and a soft playmat lay on the floor. "Here's your new home, Esperanza," Valentina said, showing her the room. "Do you think she'll like it?" Consuelo asked. "Of course she will. It's so cozy and full of light." The first days at home were hard. Esperanza slept poorly at night, cried often, and Valentina wasn't getting any rest. Consuelo helped however she could, cooking meals, washing baby clothes, sitting with her granddaughter while Valentina showered or simply rested. "Maybe we should hire a nanny?" she suggested one morning when Valentina looked especially exhausted. "No," Valentina replied firmly. "I want to raise my daughter myself, at least while she's this little." "Then let me move in with you for a while. I'm lonely in my apartment anyway." "And your place? It's not going anywhere. I'll stop by once a week to air it out and clean." Consuelo did move in and became a second mother to Esperanza, getting up with her at night, singing lullabies, taking the stroller out to the courtyard while Valentina handled chores. Gradually, life found a steady rhythm. Days passed in caring for the baby, household tasks, and occasional walks around the city. To her surprise, Valentina discovered she didn't miss her old life at all, with its sham luxury and the constant strain of turning a blind eye to her husband's odd behavior. When Esperanza turned 3 months old, Valentina felt, for the first time in a long while, ready to look farther into the future than just the next day. She began thinking about work, about continuing her studies and getting an additional qualification, about buying a car to make getting around the city with a child easier. "You know," she said to Consuelo one evening, "I'm thinking of enrolling in a child psychology course. I want to better understand how to raise Esperanza the right way." "Great idea," her mother-in-law approved. "And you could think about English classes too. It's very useful nowadays." "Yes, I could learn English as well. It'll come in handy when Esperanza grows up. They made plans, and in those plans there was no room for longing for the past or fear of the future, only confidence that they would overcome every difficulty and create a happy childhood for little Esperanza. In May, a letter arrived from Javier. Consuelo brought it to Valentina, but she couldn't bring herself to open the envelope. It lay on the desk in the study, which had now become the playroom, reminding her of the part of life she wished to forget. Maybe read it after all? Consuelo suggested gently. I'm not ready, Valentina admitted. I'm afraid he'll be asking for forgiveness, or worse, blaming us for turning him in. What if he just wants to know about his daughter? Valentina thought it over. Javier had a right to know he had a daughter. Despite everything, he remained Esperanza's father. All right, she decided, I'll read it, but not today. A week later, while Esperanza slept peacefully in her stroller on the balcony and Consuelo was out shopping, Valentina took the letter and opened it. Javier wrote briefly and restrainedly. He thanked them for stopping him before he committed even worse crimes. He asked forgiveness for his deceit and betrayal. He inquired about his wife's health and the baby to come. At the end, there was a postscript. If it's a daughter, name her Esperanza. Let her have what I lacked, hope for an honest life. Valentina reread the letter several times before realizing she had chosen exactly the name the child's father had wanted. Perhaps it was a sign that some invisible threads of kinship and understanding still remained between them. She sat down at the table and wrote a reply. She told him about Esperanza's birth and enclosed a photo of the baby asleep in a pink swaddle. She wrote that she didn't hold a grudge and wished him the strength to start a new life after his release. That evening, she and Consuelo went for a walk in the city park. Spring was especially beautiful that year. The trees covered in tender green, tulips and daffodils blooming in the beds, the air filled with the scent of lilacs. Look, Esperanza, what pretty flowers, Valentina said, pointing out the bright colors of the flower beds. The little girl studied the world around her intently and smiled now and then when something caught her attention. On a bench by the fountain, they met a young mother with a boy about a year old. The women struck up a conversation and discovered they had much in common. Both were raising children without fathers, both worked at schools, both dreamed of giving their children a good education and a decent future. You know, said the new acquaintance, named Patricia, I used to think raising a child without a husband would be very hard. Turns out that when you have a goal and desire, you can manage anything. Yes, Valentina agreed. The main thing is to love your child and believe everything will work out. They exchanged numbers and agreed to meet for walks. It felt good to Valentina to meet a woman in a similar situation who hadn't given up, but had found the strength to build a new life. On the way home, they stopped at the cemetery where Consuelo's father was buried. Consuelo placed a bouquet of daisies on the grave. Hello, Papa, she said quietly. I want you to meet your great-granddaughter. Her name is Esperanza. Valentina stood beside her, holding her daughter, thinking how strange life was. She had never known the man under that headstone, yet his daughter had become closer to her than her own mother, and his grandson, the man she had loved and considered the dearest person in the world, had turned out to be a stranger. Do you think he would have been happy about his great-granddaughter? Valentina asked. Absolutely, Consuelo replied with conviction. He loved children very much, and he would be proud of you for finding the strength to start anew. On the way back, Esperanza woke and cried. Valentina stopped to feed her and suddenly realized she no longer felt the heaviness in her chest that had tormented her for months. The pain of her husband's betrayal hadn't vanished, but it had stopped defining her life. Consuelo, she said as they neared home, I want you to know you saved Esperanza and me. If not for you, I don't know what would have become of us. We saved each other. her mother-in-law answered gently. "You gave me the chance to feel needed, and I gave you support when you needed it most." At home, a surprise awaited them, a bouquet of white roses on the windowsill by the door, and a note from their neighbor. "Congratulations on your daughter's birth. Wishing you happiness and health. Carmen." "See," Consuelo said, setting the flowers in a vase. "People wish you well. Life goes on, and it can be beautiful." That evening, while Esperanza slept and Consuelo watched TV in the living room, Valentina sat by the nursery window and thought about the future. The spring day was fading. Light clouds drifted across the sky like boats from children's tales. She thought about what her daughter would grow up to be, what she would teach her, how she would explain life's complexities without robbing her of faith in people and hope for the best. She thought about the job awaiting her in a year, about new acquaintances, about the possibility of someday loving and being loved again. Most importantly, she no longer feared the future. She had a daughter who needed a strong mother. She had Consuelo, who had become her family. She had the chance to start over and build a life on honest, solid foundations. "Good night, my little Esperanza," she whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. "Tomorrow will be a new day, full of new discoveries and new joys." And for the first time in many months, Valentina fell asleep peacefully, without anxiety or nightmares, with a smile on her face and faith in her heart. Share what you think. Every response matters. A like and a subscription would be a lovely boost. May your day bring joy.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.